Humans have always organized themselves into thriving communities. It may have more vegetation as the ones you see here, more houses, or even it may be a thriving metropolis. But nonetheless, we've always tried to organize ourselves together. But how did they do it in the past? Or let's think about how did they organize themselves in the past, and how did they thrive politically, socially, and economically, especially during the Middle Ages? That's what we're going to find out. But if you had the choice to live in any one of these three areas, which one would you pick and why? For me, all of these have attributes that I like. The sprawling vegetation, the nice homes, and living near the cities where I can have fun. We often use the past to figure out how we thrive in the future. Or we also look in the future and see how we structured ourselves in the past. In this case, we're going to figure out how humans or how Europeans during a certain time period organized themselves into towns and villages, and how those towns and villages affected each other politically, socially, and economically. And the time period that we're looking at is called the medieval period or the Middle Ages. This is the time period from 400 CE to 1400 CE. And during this time period, this is the time that we encountered feudalism. And what we're looking at in this particular unit or in this particular lesson is feudalism in medieval Europe. These are the vocabulary that are very important to this particular lesson. Take time now to make sure that you write down these notes in your guided notes or data decode. This is vassal, fief, feudalism, and manor. Before the 400 CE, Europe had been unified under the rule of the Western Roman Empire, the empire that you see right here. However, the Western Roman Empire fell, and that developed into smaller kingdoms which emerged after they fell. But those smaller kingdoms had big problems. The kings began fighting each other, and because they began fighting each other, they needed to find people to protect them and to be loyal to them. So kings came up with this idea to divide up their land into large chunks and offer noblemen in exchange for their loyalty. So in other words, the king, as you see here, is offering some parts of his land to this nobleman, and in exchange the nobleman will offer his loyalty and protection to the king. The nobleman would agree to defend the king if someone attacked the kingdom, and usually gave a share of his crops grown on the land as well, and sometimes even taxes. This was known as a vassal, someone who receives land in exchange for loyalty or service. So the nobleman then became a vassal of the king. This is called a fief, or the piece of land that was given to a vassal from the king. The vassal will then also divide up his land and give that piece of land to others for loyalty and protection for himself. These men were usually called knights, and then they became vassals to the nobles. So the knights are vassals to the nobles, and the noble is a vassal to the king. And this is a system that is called feudalism. But how did this system of feudalism change the nature of European communities? Well, let's take a look at the social pyramid. At the top, the king and queen would be at the head because they had the most power and they owned the most land. Next in line would be the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was a very powerful unit, and if you remember from the last lesson we talked about in the last unit, Christianity became very, very big, especially in Western and Eastern Europe. So the Catholic Church had a lot of property and a lot of political power. After the Catholic Church came nobles. Nobles, of course, were given fiefs or land from the king or queen in exchange for loyalty and protection. After nobles were then knights. Again, being a vassal to the nobles, they too got land in exchange for protection and loyalty to the nobles. But for all of this, if the king and queen are at the top of the society, and it's only a few of them and not much, who's at the bottom, and who is the most or the biggest group of people in European society? Can you guess? Well, if you said peasants and serfs, then you're absolutely correct. Peasants and serfs were the majority of medieval European society. And they were the ones that were at least 90% of the society. As a matter of fact, serfs were even lower than peasants and were often restricted to the land that they were born on. They had the least amount of power. So how did feudalism shape how Europeans lived? So this is life on the feudal manor. As you see, this is a very big, sprawling piece of land. Out here is where the manor house, or where the lord lived. Here is the village church, and this belonged to the lord of the house. Here you have the grassy fields where villagers would make clothing, they would tend to the sheep and so forth. Here, this is where the villagers were. They would harvest wheat. Here's the mill house. They would make breads and so forth. And many of the peasants and serfs would live in these thatch houses right here, next to the crops where they would harvest and plant wheat in order to have food to eat. So life in the manor house. At the manor house, the man of the house, as I mentioned before, was known as the lord. He had absolute power and made all of the decisions for the entire manor. However, his wife and children were considered property. As a matter of fact, young men were trained to become fighters or knights, and they were also educated. However, young women or girls were trained to do things in the house or be a housekeeper, such as cooking, cleaning, sewing, etc. Life in the manor house was very, very nice and pleasant. They had nice roofs, they had a stone floor, they had nice bedding, and they even had a chimney, as you see here, to help them keep warm during the winter. This is life at the peasant cottage. Peasant cottages were small houses with only 1 or 2 rooms. Glass was expensive, so their windows were just holes covered with wooden planks, if it had that. The floors were made up of straw laid over dirt, and there was hardly any furniture. What happened to the bathroom? Oh, there it is. It's right here. The bathroom was an outhouse, which was a bucket that was outside. And sometimes, or most of the time, in order to get rid of their excrements, they would throw it outside here at the river. And this was the same river that peasants would usually gather water from to drink. Think about that. This was life expectancy in medieval Europe. Based on this chart, who do you think lived longer, kings or peasants? If you said the king, then you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, the king lived 10 times longer than a peasant, according to this chart. Why would the king live longer than the peasant? What do you think? If you said that a peasant life was hard and tough, then you're absolutely right. Peasants would work from sun up to sundown in the fields, and they were actually even born on the fields and could not leave the fields. So their life expectancy would more than likely be lower because of the amount of back-breaking work that they had to do, and they had to do it every single day. So that's all about feudalism in medieval Europe. Thank you for learning with me, and I will see you in the next video.